Now to a statement by Michael Matheson on COVID-19. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak buttons or to put an R in the chat function on Blue Jeans. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Michael Matheson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to take this opportunity to update Parliament on the Scottish Government's approach to international travel and border health measures. I'll set out more detail shortly, but I can confirm that from Monday the 15th of February, all international travellers arriving directly in Scotland by air will be subject to a requirement to enter managed isolation. Before I do, I first want to provide the latest COVID statistics for Scotland, which the First Minister announced earlier today. These help set the context for the actions that we consider necessary on travel and border controls. Yesterday, 822 positive cases were reported. This represents 7.2% of all tests that were carried out. There are 1,618 people in hospital, which is a decrease of 54 from yesterday. 112 people are in intensive care, 4 more than yesterday. I'm sorry to confirm that in the past 24 hours, there were a further 58 deaths registered of patients who first tested positive over the previous 28 days. As a result, there are now 6,501 deaths under that measurement. I extend my sympathy and condolences to everyone who's lost a beloved member of their family or friend. These numbers are still much higher than we would like, but they show this wave of the pandemic starting to recede. At the same time, vaccine deployment continues at pace. We expect this week to exceed 1 million total vaccinations in Scotland. As of 8:30 this morning, 928,122 people in Scotland have received their first dose of the vaccine. These encouraging signs help explain why, in the Scottish Government's view, stronger restrictions on international travel are needed. The COG UK report on genomic sequencing shows the role that international travel played in the rise in cases last summer. Around 40% of new lineages in Scotland identified in that analysis came directly from overseas through international travel. The rest came from elsewhere within the UK. We also know the nature of the risk from international travel has now changed. We face a different challenge in variants of the coronavirus than we faced last year. 2 specific mutations give cause for concern. And this concern is increased because they have emerged repeatedly and independently in different parts of the world. One mutation is believed to be associated with increased transmittability. It makes it easier to spread the virus. The second mutation is believed to be associated with resistance to protective antibodies, so that if you have already had COVID-19, you could be at risk of reinfection from the variant. This could mean vaccines we are deploying may be less effective against these variants. The variant identified in South Africa has both of these mutations, as does a second variant found in Brazil. It is vital that we do everything possible to prevent these variants entering Scotland and gaining a foothold. We cannot risk variants from international travel undermining the deployment of our vaccine. Of course, these case numbers still matter. Our border health measures play an important role in suppressing new cases in Scotland. But protecting the vaccine and helping us to return to a greater degree of normality in our day-to-day lives is now also a major part of the purpose of the international travel regulations. The Scottish Government is clear that policy on international travel control must be guided by expert clinical advice. That advice is clear. We need a comprehensive approach to restricting international travel. SAGE concluded in papers published just last week, and I quote, "Reactive, geographically targeted travel bans cannot be relied upon to stop importation of new variants." They went on and stated they highlighted the lag between emergence and identification of variants of concern, as well as the potential for indirect travel to the UK via a third country. Unfortunately, at the present moment, Presiding Officer, the UK Government continues to rely on a targeted, reactive approach. This has been what we, along with other UK nations, have been doing up to now. That has led to additional restrictions on travel from areas at risk from the variants identified in South Africa and Brazil, covering South America, large parts of Africa and countries with close travel links to those regions. It's clear that this approach is no longer sufficient to provide the protection necessary. It depends upon the ability of the Joint Biosecurity Centre to assess the risk of variants. The GBC will update us on countries subject to these measures next week. But the key challenge is the ability of data to inform the JBC analysis. With very limited genomic sequencing going on globally, data on new variants is unreliable. So it's very hard to say with confidence where the high-risk countries are, even for the variants we know about. That's why, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government wants a comprehensive approach to managed isolation. So from Monday, we will require all international travellers arriving directly on flights into Scotland to enter managed isolation. This goes further than the measures announced by the UK Health Secretary earlier this afternoon. The UK Government has only committed to adopting this for travellers returning from red list countries. We know that is not sufficient, and we have therefore gone further. We believe that all international travellers, with some limited exceptions, should meet the requirement to isolate in managed facilities. The Welsh First Minister has echoed that, arguing that anyone entering the UK should be expected to go into quarantine. But our aim on international travel has always been to work on a four-nations basis where possible. We are engaged with the UK, Welsh Government and the Northern Ireland Executive to agree a joint approach to contracting the transport and accommodation services required for managed isolation. This will involve a common approach to procurement of hotels and related services, initially in England and in Scotland, based on a UK Government contract. This will have flexibility to respond to the different policy directions we are taking and ensure all arrivals are required to enter quarantine here in Scotland. Passengers flying to Scotland from overseas will be required to book and pay for mandatory isolation in a quarantine hotel through a common online portal. That system, operated by the UK Government, will go live on Thursday. We've identified 6 hotels close to Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Glasgow airports, with a combined capacity of 1,300 rooms. The cost for the first traveller in a room will be £1,750, with supplements for additional family members. These costs will include a mandatory testing regime, and we will require all arrivals to be tested twice, on day 2 and day 8 after arrival. At launch, this will be through the UK testing programme, with the intent to quickly move to private sector provision. However, there is currently capacity in the Lighthouse Lab to meet the needs of the present travel levels. We'll develop a managed isolation welfare fund for travellers who may struggle to meet the charges associated with this. We've been in touch with the airports. Transport Scotland officials briefed Edinburgh and AGS over the weekend, and the Connectivity Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, is discussing managed isolation with Scottish airports as I speak. The number of travellers coming to Scotland directly is reducing, and I expect these restrictions to reduce arrivals yet further. There were approximately 1,600 in the last week of January, but that fell to only 730 in the first week of February. But the number of people also transiting via international hubs is greater. Passengers entering England from the red list countries who then seek to travel on to Scotland will have to isolate in a hotel in England. Last week, that was around 130 people. We continue to press the UK Government to adopt what we believe is a more comprehensive approach and require all arrivals to go into quarantine hotels. We've asked the UK Government to work with us to identify international travellers not caught by this approach, so that arrangements can be made for them to isolate in a quarantine hotel in line with the policy in Scotland. These measures will be backed with criminal offences as usual. That will add to the powers that enforcement bodies already have at their disposal, such as culpable and reckless conduct. We're working closely with Police Scotland, Border Force and other justice partners on implementing a range of offences and penalties to support the managed isolation policy and to aid compliance. Of course, no non-essential international travel is allowed at present. It's important that people adhere to these rules. We will continue to keep them under review and to consider whether there is more that needs to be done to protect our communities from the risk of importation. There will be some exceptions from the requirement to isolate in managed facilities. However, many exceptions will require travellers to self-isolate at home or their own accommodation. They will only be able to leave isolation for the essential work that they are here to do. A very small number of arrivals will not be required to isolate. For example, in essential supply chains for goods coming into Scotland, foreign diplomats and essential defence activities. We are also tightening some of our existing exemptions further. This will include limiting overseas training for elite sports people to athletes and coaches preparing for the Olympics and Paralympics. Presiding Officer, the number of international travellers coming into Scotland has fallen significantly. Non-essential travel remains unlawful, and the majority of arrivals right now are required to self-isolate at home. The stronger approach we are taking is necessary and proportionate. I expect tougher restrictions to lead to a further reduction in travel numbers. As Transport Secretary, I understand the impact these vital measures to protect Scotland from the virus will have on the aviation sector. There is a role for the sector to play, and we will work closely with the airlines and airports to ensure passengers are conveyed safely and securely at all stages of their journey. We are supporting the sector, including by maintaining our package of business rates relief for airports, But given the challenges that the aviation sector in Scotland is facing, I intend to build on our existing engagement and create an aviation working group. It's important that this group meets the needs of the sector, and we will therefore work with our industry stakeholders to refine its scope. Presiding Officer, we have had to make many difficult decisions in the course of this pandemic. This is no different. It's clear that to manage the risk of importation of new variants and to give vaccine deployment the best chance to bring us closer to normality here in Scotland, we have to place further limitations on international travel. For these to be effective as possible, I will continue to encourage UK ministers to match our ambition and to help protect Scotland and all of the UK.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. We'll move now to questions. Graeme Simpson to be followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's normal at this point that I would thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement. However, it arrived just minutes before he got to his feet, which I think is unacceptable. However, I'm delighted that the Scottish Government's vaccine rollout has speeded up. The progress could have happened faster, but we're pleased that the pace has finally picked up. Now, the Cabinet Secretary has given us some information today about new quarantine measures for people arriving in Scotland. Airports need to be fully on board and they need to understand what's expected of them. But until today, as we've heard, no minister had been in touch with any of them about these plans. So, a few questions for the Cabinet Secretary. Can he tell us why ministers didn't engage with the airline sector at an earlier stage? Is there yet a UK agreement to contract transport and accommodation? Have any hotel rooms been procured yet? And other than the business rate relief already announced, when will sector-specific support be available?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, let me deal with the first point that Graeme Simpson has made, and my apologies for the late arrival of the statement. It was a combination of appearing at committee and also dealing with a number of weather-related issues that prevented my own ability to be able to finalise the statement and for it to be distributed to members. But I do apologise for the late arrival of it to members. Presiding Officer, I've had extensive discussions with airports, airlines and aviation-related businesses over the course of the last year on a very, very regular basis on a whole range of different matters that have been taken forward. But the member will also recognise the complexity of the procurement process that's had to be put in place and to operationalise the provision of managed isolation hotels. And due to the Four Nations approach which we have taken, that has taken longer than we would have all liked it to have been. Having now settled on an agreed approach that's been taken forward, we're now informing those within the aviation sector exactly how that is going to be rolled out. And that's exactly what is happening right now with Paul Wheelhouse in discussions with Edinburgh and AGS airports, taking them through that particular process. In relation to the UK agreement for transportation and accommodation, what I can advise the member is that the UK Government contract that we are using for this purpose, in partnership with the UK Government, has identified all of the hotel accommodation that will be block booked by the Scottish Government for the purposes of delivering managed isolation for the 15th of February. And we have given details of that to the UK Government in order to make sure that that is put in place through the UK Government contract. That work has now been taken forward by civil servants to ensure that it is in place for the 15th of February next week. And on the member's final point in relation to business rates relief, he does give the impression as though we have just given them business rates relief and that's about it, and we have done nothing else. I would gently point out to the member, we've provided business rates relief to aviation and airport sectors within Scotland. The UK Government hasn't. And we have repeatedly said to the UK Government that they need to show a greater commitment to supporting the wider aviation sector in the whole of the UK, and to date they have failed to do so. But what I can assure the member of is that we will continue to provide them with the rates relief, as we have said, for the first 3 months of the next financial year. And we will continue to press the UK Government to provide a package of support to assist the aviation sector right across the UK through what is a very challenging and difficult time for them.
Thank you. Colin Smith to be followed by Alice Cole-Hamilton. Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A year ago, the World Health Organization said the key to tackling COVID was test, test, test. In response, this government has been slow to introduce airport testing, having voted against Labour's call for this in Parliament 5 months ago. Slow to introduce a quarantine system that is properly enforced, with at one point just 1 in 10 of people arriving at Scotland's airports actually receiving a follow-up check, and slow to provide support to a civil aviation sector which is frankly hemorrhaging jobs, and we still have no sign of any sector-specific support. The lack of consultations with Scotland's airports ahead of this announcement probably does suggest that the final details have still not been fully worked out. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, why has it taken, first of all, 10 months from the first lockdown to introduce airport testing and a quarantine regime that will be properly enforced? And can I ask him to explain in detail, first of all, how we will avoid passengers circumventing the isolation regime by flying via countries that are not effectively covered by the red zone list in England, but landing at airports in England, but then travelling to their final destination here in Scotland? Has detailed proposals been agreed with the UK Government that, for example, anyone arriving at Manchester Airport or Heathrow Airport is and has to isolate, and you have details of that, has to isolate at the point of arrival in Manchester and or London or wherever else? And can I ask him again specifically, will the Government give serious consideration to providing sector-specific support for aviation? We've seen other areas provided with sector-specific support, but this is an industry that will be hemorrhaging jobs for some time to come. And finally, what plans does it have to put in place?
That's about 4 questions already.
Okay, well,
Cabinet
I'm sure that the Cabinet Secretary will give 4 good answers.
As I always do, Presiding Officer. So, what I can say to, what I would say to Colin Smith and his general comments around international borders, I think it would be fair to say that if we look back on the course of the last 10 months, an area where I think we collectively as a government regret that more robust action was not taken following the first wave of coronavirus last year, was to apply stricter restrictions to international travel and the risks which were associated with that. That doesn't just apply here in Scotland, it applies across the whole of the UK and actually broadly all across the whole of Europe, which is why we're determined to take as much action as we can within our powers to help to minimise that risk again this time round. And I think it would be fair to say that the First Minister has said on a number of occasions we will not always get everything right, but what we will always do, that where we think we can do things better and we can learn from the past, we will ensure that we do so. And that's exactly what we're doing around international travel. And can I say, when the member also makes reference to this idea about the challenges in the civil aviation sector, I'm sure it is not lost on the member that Scotland was the first and only part of the UK to offer business rates relief to the aviation sector at the very outset of this pandemic, recognising the marked impact that it would have on the sector, and we will continue to do everything we can. However, the reality is that many of the major aviation businesses do not base themselves in Scotland, although they may operate in Scotland. They are based out with our direct jurisdiction, which is why it's essential that the UK Government put in place a package of support for the civil aviation sector going forward. Can I pick up on the point that the member made, and that was in relation to individuals travelling into English airports where they are not coming from a red list country, but they are coming from overseas and will then travel on to Scotland. This is one of the issues which we are discussing with the UK Government. This system would work better if we had a comprehensive system right across the whole of the UK, which I know his colleagues at Westminster have been arguing for and which we continue to press the UK Government to introduce. That would reduce the risk of anyone seeking to circumvent any arrangements we put here in Scotland. But if we are not able to get that, we are asking the UK Government to work with us to identify those who are coming into English airports that are travelling on to Scotland, that they are assigned to a quarantine hotel in England for the purposes of their managed isolation over that 10-day period, in line with Scottish Government policy. We don't have agreement with the UK Government in that matter as yet, but we will continue to pursue that with them as we go forward, because that will help to reduce the risk yet further here in Scotland. And what I will finish off by saying to the member is that we will do everything we can to support the aviation sector, but he will recognise that there are limitations to what we can do directly here in Scotland, given the UK nature of the business and international nature of the business, which is why the UK Government need to bring forward a support package.
Thank you. Alex Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the past few minutes, I've had correspondence about this statement from Edinburgh Airport, one of the biggest employers in my constituency. They've informed me that they only received notice and the details of this plan as the Cabinet Secretary got to his feet some moments ago. Does the Cabinet Secretary feel this is an appropriate approach to involving the aviation sector, especially when airports must play a key role in the delivery of this, not least in the safe disembarkation of passengers and delivery to the quarantine hotels?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Presiding Officer, we've indicated to Edinburgh Airport and others within the aviation sector last week about the direction of travel in which we're going in and the implications of that. But I'm sure the member would recognise that it's my responsibility to come and to explain matters to Parliament and to set out the approach which the Scottish Government is taking on such an important issue that has an impact on so many individuals, whether they be travelling or work within the aviation sector. That's why, at the time of making this statement, we arranged to meet with the airports to provide them with a much greater level of detail. So the member can be assured that our first line of responsibility here is to Parliament in explaining these matters, and that we will continue to work with the aviation industry to ensure that they are provided with the relevant information to ensure that we can deliver this next week once we move to implementation of the managed quarantine arrangements.
Thank you. Patrick Harvey, to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Minister for the statement, and I'm personally glad that it was announced to Parliament rather than going to vested interests before Parliament was informed. I welcome the moves that are being made to introduce additional measures for the immediate period ahead, but the statement didn't say very much about the longer term. Will the Cabinet Secretary rule out the idea, which has been touted elsewhere, of vaccine passports, which would both carry a risk of continued transmission of new variants as they emerge, and would also risk establishing a principle that people's civil rights are dependent on their medical history?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I'm grateful to the member for his comments, and he made reference to our approach in the longer term and in specific reference to vaccine passports. What I would say to the member is that I don't believe that there is a need for the use of vaccine passports at the present moment. They are not, in my view, an adequate replacement for the protection that you get from a managed quarantine programme and from ensuring that individuals are being tested prior to arrival in the country and tested once they've arrived in the country. It may be at some point in the future that vaccine passports may have some part to play. However, I do recognise that there are some civil liberties issues that would also have to be addressed before that could happen. So, in short, I don't believe that they have a role to play in the short to medium term, but in the longer term, they may have a part to play. But there are some civil liberties issues that need to be addressed before a programme of vaccine passports could be rolled out at a national or international level.
Thank you. Joan McAlpine, to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you very much, and I very much welcome the Cabinet Secretary's statement and the Scottish Government's comprehensive approach. However, I wanted to raise a constituency issue. The Camphill community, which is a presence at Loch Arthur in my South Scotland constituency, relies on young volunteer health and social care workers coming from Europe. They've written to me pointing out that their volunteer model is already being very hard hit by Brexit, and they're concerned that their volunteers would not be able to meet the cost of hotel quarantine, meaning even fewer volunteers. As I say, I welcome the quarantine measures, but can the government say how it will affect charities like Camphill, and is any sort of financial mitigation possible?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I think the first thing I would say is that right now, anyone who is considering travelling internationally or even domestically is that they should only be doing so for absolutely essential reasons. And the law is very clear on that matter. In relation to the impact that some of the costs could have on organisations within the charitable sector that may have individuals who are coming to the country for essential purposes, that we are establishing a welfare fund to help to address some of the financial needs that individuals may face given the costs which are associated with this. I hope in the coming days to be able to set out more details of how that will operate, and what I will do is I will undertake to ensure that as we move forward this week with more details on the welfare arrangements and other arrangements for operationalising this policy, that are right to all MSPs setting out that process and also the routes that they can go down in order to get further information or clarity in points that they may want further information on.
Thank you. Jamie Halker-Johnson, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what discussions his government has undertaken over the potential impact of these increased restrictions on Scotland's regional and local airports, including many across my region, and the airlines which maintain lifeline links with some of the most remote communities?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, most of the, with the exception of Inverness Airport, most of the Highlands and Islands Airports, limited airports, only operate on a domestic flight basis. What's having more of an impact on domestic flights is the restrictions on essential travel, which is why we are providing some financial support to Highlands and Islands Airports in order to maintain connectivity to our islands, and also through Logan Air in helping to support essential connectivity is maintained to our island communities. I recognise the point the member is making about the critical nature of this to some of our most remote communities in Scotland, but you can be assured that we will continue to offer what support we can to maintain those critical lifeline services within the aviation sector to rural Scotland.
Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Many of us have close family living overseas, and thanks to the union dividend, for example, my twin sister lives in Canada. Tragedies, often sudden, can affect anyone, and some faiths prioritise speedy committal. Therefore, will flexibility for people flying in for the funeral of a sibling, parent, son or daughter be given consideration?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we are giving consideration to that as part of the exemption regime which will be associated with managed isolation provisions. The member will recognise that we are keen to restrict the extent of the exceptions which apply to this area of policy, because if they are too broad, the accumulation of them can undermine the policy intent itself. But issues around compassionate grounds are matters that we are considering and will be considered as part of the final regulations that we'll be looking to introduce to Parliament later this week.
Sarah Boyack, to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Given that our airports have now been operating in an extremely uncertain world for a year now, what work is being done to develop a recovery plan for our airports? And in particular, what work has the Cabinet Secretary initiated to help ensure that we have retain the direct flights to Scotland going forward, which have been introduced in recent years, given the likelihood of smaller fleets all round?
Cabinet Secretary.
So there are two elements to this that are already started, which I've commissioned officials to take forward. One is in relation to looking at what recovery will look like within the aviation sector and what we can do to help to support the sector with its recovery. And the second element of that is in looking at route recovery directly itself, what support we can provide to assist the recovery of some of the routes that we have lost. I think Sarah Boyack raises an important point, and that is that within the aviation sector, there has been a significant reduction in fleet size and capacity within the airline sector specifically. Therefore, competition to recover some of these routes will be greater than it was in the past, which is why I've commissioned officials to look at how we can develop a recovery programme that can assist us in prioritising the routes that we want to target for re-establishing when we are in a position to do so. So that was an early piece of work that officials have already started taking forward and have discussed with the airports, I understand, on several occasions now, and we'll also look at the further wider recovery work within the aviation sector overall as part of the working group that will consider some of these wider challenges as we go forward in the months ahead.
Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In drawing up the exemptions regime that the Cabinet Secretary referred to a moment ago, can the Cabinet Secretary indicate what thought is being given to those who need to work abroad, but who do so on rotation, that is to say, some weeks on in the third country, some weeks home leave? Can the Cabinet Secretary indicate whether such Scottish workers will be required to quarantine in a hotel each time, at not inconsiderable expense, or whether self-isolation at home could be considered as an alternative?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we are looking at a couple of areas in relation to exemptions. And if I pick up on the general point that the member's making and refer specifically, say, to the oil and gas sector, where staff very often work on rotation, we are giving very specific consideration to the way in which any of the exemptions would operate for the oil and gas sector, including whether the option of self-isolating at home during their period of leave would be more appropriate rather than using a managed isolation at hotel. So these are matters which we are actively considering at the present moment. We're seeking to try and align with other parts of the UK in this matter in order to try and simplify the process as much as possible. But I can assure the member it's an issue that's been given active consideration at the present moment.
Rachel Hamilton, to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Has the Scottish Government carried out modelling of the economic impact of these quarantine measures, and has modelling been carried out in the event coronavirus continues to mutate?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the approach which we are taking in relation to managed isolation is based upon clinical advice, and the very clear advice that we run the risk of importing further variants of the virus which could undermine the progress that we're making with our vaccination programme and with suppressing the virus here in Scotland if we don't manage international travel into Scotland and the UK much more effectively. And what's very clear from the Joint Biosecurity Centre's assessment is that the existing regime is no longer fit for purpose, and that a comprehensive system is much more effective in doing that. I would not ignore the very significant economic impact that this has on sectors within Scotland, in particular the aviation sector. But what we're trying to do is balance off the competing challenges between the aviation sector and international travel with that of trying to get some level of domestic normality here in Scotland by reducing the risk of importing new variants of this virus. So there's a balance that has to be struck here. And what we're trying to do is to do that in a way that helps to get normality back here in Scotland as quickly as possible, helping to support our economy to return to normal as a result of that.
Thank you. Christine Graham, to be followed by Alec Rowley.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, I note from your statement that 40% new lineage virus comes to Scotland from overseas international travel. That obviously means that 60% comes from elsewhere in the UK. What more can be done to reduce that worrying 60% figure?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Christine Graham raises an important issue. The first thing that people can do is that they can comply with the regulations, and that is don't travel unless it is absolutely essential, whether it be between Scotland and England or within Scotland as well. So stick to the rules, because in doing that, it helps us all to suppress the virus much more effectively. What I can say to Christine Graham is that I have, as have other devolved nations, raised the issue of the existing arrangements across the common travel area. That's England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And the fifth area is the Republic of Ireland. And the risk of importation and transportation of the virus across these common borders. And one of the issues that we are seeking to look at making progress on is how we can help to reduce the risk of the transporting of the virus across different parts of the common travel area. So there are discussions taking place on a four nations basis, and I understand that the UK Government are also engaging with the Irish Government specifically on measures that could be introduced to reduce that risk further. So it's an area which has been actively considered. We'd like to see further progress made on what measures can be put in place. And I can assure the member, if we're in a position to do something more in relation to this, we will take appropriate action to do so.
Thank you. Alec Rowley, to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Presiding Officer, my heart goes out to the families of the 58 people who have died of COVID over the last 24 hours. And I'm sure that Michael Matheson will accept that the fact that there's 6,501 deaths in Scotland, he'll understand why older people in particular are terrified of this virus. Therefore, I have to raise with him the absolute chaos that pursued yesterday in Fife around vaccine centres, where older people were left queuing in the freezing and cold for up to an hour, 2 hours, some to just be sent back home. And my question therefore is, why is it that people over 70 in rural Fife are not able to do the same as people over 80, which was able to access their local GP practice and health centre? I'm told the reason for this is it's cheaper to do it through the hubs. But does he accept that whether it's cheaper or not, it's not practical for old people to be told they have to get on 2 buses in order to reach a vaccination centre? I'm also told that the government told NHS Fife to cut the vaccine time from 7 minutes per vaccine to 3 minutes per vaccine. I understand we want people vaccinated, but we cannot have such chaos. Will the Cabinet Secretary agree to look at what the issues are in Fife and get them sorted as soon as possible?
Thanks, Mr Rowley. I think that question might be better put to Jean Freeman, the Cabinet Secretary, who will be taking an urgent question on this very matter shortly. If the Cabinet Secretary wishes to give a very brief reply.
Other than to say, Presiding Officer, I recognise the concerns which Alec Rowley has raised, and I know that NHS Fife have apologised for the error that was made yesterday with their booking arrangement. But as the Presiding Officer has rightly pointed out, there is an urgent question due to be answered on this very matter following my statement, and I know that the Cabinet Secretary for Health has indicated that she will seek to address the points that Mr Rowley has raised.
Thank you. Willie Coffey, to be followed by Alexander Stewart.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned a moment ago the 4 nations, 5 nations discussions that you're having with the UK Government, Welsh and Irish governments. What is it we need to do to ensure that folk who are landing somewhere else in the UK and travelling up here to Scotland actually comply with the quarantine, and who would monitor that?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the most effective way for managed isolation to operate is that an individual goes into a quarantine facility at their point of arrival into the country, not at the end of their journey within that country. And the point that we have made to the UK Government, given the policy approach that we're taking here in Scotland, we would like all individuals coming into the UK where their final destination is Scotland, that they should go into managed isolation hotels. That would require the UK Government to implement our policy at the other airports that will be entry points within England. To date, we don't have agreement on that matter, but I can assure the member we're continuing to pursue that with them, because that would assist us greatly in ensuring that we reduce the risk of the new variant being introduced into Scotland. Notwithstanding that, I strongly believe, based upon all of the clinical advice I've read, the assessment that came from COG, the Joint Biosecurity Assessment Centre's assessment of this matter, the most effective way for the whole of the UK to address the issue of reducing the risk of new variants being introduced into Scotland and the rest of the UK is through a comprehensive managed quarantine system right across the whole of the UK. And I still believe that is the best thing that the UK government could put in place to address some of those wider concerns that we have about individuals arriving at airports in England.
Alexander Stewart, to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish airports will need to transport passengers from aircrafts to their quarantine venues. Therefore, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to confirm how these transfers will take place and who will be carrying out these transfers?
Cabinet Secretary.
This is part of the contract that's been taken forward and been implemented across the 4 nations. The arrangements will be that from the point of arrival is that those individuals who require to go into self-isolation hotels will be taken and transported to the hotel that they have been allocated. So the whole process will start from the point of arrival right through to the point of being transported to the managed isolation hotel. And that will all be part of a comprehensive package that's been put in place as part of the contract arrangement.
And Bob Doris.
Presiding Officer, I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's announcement on supervised quarantine, as we have seen that this is a successful measure to help tackle the spread of COVID-19 in other countries. But can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how will the Scottish Government engage with accommodation providers to ensure that appropriate infection control measures are maintained to the appropriate high standard consistently at all times within the hotels that will be booked?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the specification for the hotels sets out a range of measures that they have to put in place, including specifications that relate to the hygiene standards that need to be maintained and also security that has to be maintained within the facility. The arrangements in the hotel will be as an individual is allocated a room. They will not be able to mix with other guests in that room. They will obviously be provided with their meals and drinks, etc., as part of a complete package of measures, and also the tests that will be carried out during the course of their period of isolation. And all of the arrangements that the hotels need to have in place are part of that wider contract that they must comply with. I suspect that going forward, that in the introduction of any complex piece of arrangement like this, there will be some challenges at the start. There will be some areas where it will need to improve, or we'll have to smooth out some of the initial difficulties. But the contract seeks to address all of the issues in relation to making sure hygiene standards are maintained and that arrangements around security and the isolation of those who are residing in the hotels is maintained appropriately as well.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our statement on COVID-19.